the rescuer's mission. Trump is praising himself again.
If I had been president, this war would never have happened. And if I hadn't been president, this war could have led to World War III. That won't happen. And
he also promises to hand out money to Americans.
The President of the United States announced that every American will receive $2,000 in dividends.
Mass import of labor force. Putin asked India for help.
At the end of 2025, more than 70,000 Indians will be working in Russia. They are expected to work in construction, factories, textiles and electronics.
Sanctions are working. Lukoil has declared force majeure at its largest oil field.
This is a blow not only to the corporation but also to Russia's oil presence in the Middle East.
Instead of 5 years, 3 weeks, Nicolas Sarkozy is released.
The court supported his release under strict supervision.
On Russia TV, everything is as usual. Nuclear threats right on schedule.
Until we actually hit somewhere so that they can clearly see. They're basically just asking for it, honestly.
Back to the past, a candid confession from the Belarusian leader about what awaits the country.
I don't have a mobile phone, but I somehow managed to live. We need to preserve the telephone network.
All this and more. More details on the YouTube channel Ukraine Today. This is the main news. Thank you for watching and for not forgetting to like. Hello. So, the hysteria over Poseidon and Burevestnik in the studios of Russian propaganda isn't dying down. It's only gaining momentum. Moreover, Skabiva and Popova have found a new enemy. And it's neither Zelensky nor Trump. More on the latest fits from Putin's media lackeys in the following report.
This week, Russian propaganda has once again outdone itself, both in terms of absurdity and the sheer density of nonsense per square meter. For example, in the studio of the country's chief TV preacher, Solovyov, it's thunder and lightning all over again.
We can all see what's happening right now. There are active strikes being carried out against our oil refineries. I have just one question. Are we ever actually going to start paying attention to this?
This time, the reason for universal grief and righteous anger was that Ukraine, despite everything supposedly already destroyed, continues to regularly strike Russian oil refineries.
No, I get it. The brilliant idea is to turn off mobile internet and then suddenly nothing flies anymore. I understand that the brilliant idea is to implement a carpet flight restriction, after which people suddenly can't fly during vacation season and end up sitting in airports. That really helps a lot. I just don't understand what exactly it helps with. And
on one of the propaganda shows, the audience was introduced to a hero from the front lines. A man who looked more like a character from nightmares than a soldier with a cheerful smile talked about how he approached killing children and civilians creatively.
As long as you have imagination, you can do absolutely anything you want. They planted mines in books, they planted mines in toys. They scattered those electronic cigarettes laced with poison.
Meanwhile, across the boundless expanse of Z propaganda, yet another military expert appeared, his eyes full of certainty and a touch of fear. Inspired, yet slightly deflated, he predicts that in Pokrovsk, Russian army losses will be comparable to, if not greater than those in Bakhmut.
The thing is, in Pokrovsk, we still haven't managed to completely encircle it geographically. And that's why we're forced to push them out, meaning we have to fight urban battles. And the losses there are very high, of course, on both sides. For us, they are comparable to Bakhmut.
In other words, piles of bodies just to capture a couple of streets and a ruined train station. Also this week, the Orthodox propaganda school was enriched with a new teaching. Bishop Peterim of Skopin and Shatsk declared that, as it turns out, suffering is actually a joy for the Russian person.
For us, this is a joy. Sorrow for us is bliss, not the absence of sorrow, not overindulgence, not joy, not laughter.
According to him, merriment, laughter, and in general any signs of life are an unacceptable luxury.
And the Lord says this, "Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall weep." Our ancestors understood very well where their joy was, where their happiness was, and in general, where the meaning of life lay. It is up there in heaven, not here on earth. Here on earth, we have nothing but sorrows.
Just look at how, with a familiar smile on their face and a mad gleam in their eyes, Russian TV once again threatens the whole world with nuclear weapons, presenting it as if it's not the end of civilization at all. And
we will see the hazel tree bloom and finally Poseidon Sarmat. How beautiful. Why will you finally see, perhaps for the first time, just how beautifully and gracefully the storm petrel flies over the grey expanse of the sea?
But here, the smile clearly disappears from the face. In celebration of the great return of the domestic auto industry, Russia presented the new Niva. A certain pride in import substitution and yet another reason for patriotic stories.
Neva, please, I am truly begging you. I need you to tell me. Please, tell me that I just imagined it, that it was all in my head. Tell me that's not yours. 30 kilometers on the odometer.
Across the Russian expanse, yet another preacher of traditional values made a name for himself live on air. Roman Antonovsky, a zealous Z-monarchist, professional obscurantist, and self-proclaimed Orthodox thinker, suddenly couldn't recall either the date of Christ's birth or the name of his father.
By the way, what was the name of Jesus' father?
Jesus' father was the Lord for us.
The name? The name. The name of Jesus' father. Well, who raised him?
Who raised him?
Who raised Jesus?
For us, Jesus is the Son of the Lord and the Virgin Mary.
You're a Christian, you're a believer, you regularly appear on the SPAS TV channel. You tell everyone else they should go to church. Here's a simple question for you, one that even my 3-year-old daughter knows the answer to, because, by the way, she was born. By the way, when was Jesus born? Well, there's some kind of date.
So, when was he born for us? Well, he was born 2025 years ago.
No, the date. The date. Well, the month.
From the Nativity of Christ.
So, a person who lectures the entire nation every day on how to properly love God, the Tsar, and the tank turned out to be unable to name even the most basic things from the Bible.
Next, we have a conversation with political scientist Vladimir Fisenko. He is joining our broadcast. Vladimir Vyacheslavovich, hello. Thank you for finding the time.
Good evening.
Let me start with some troubling news. Kyiv Post, citing other publications and sources familiar with internal discussions at the UN, has shared information that the administration of President Donald Trump has put forward an initiative to remove from a UN resolution the provision affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemning the Russian occupation of Crimea and other Ukrainian regions. Our viewers probably need some clarification that this is an annual procedure. Ukraine submits a draft of such a resolution, and in principle, until last year, there were no issues with its approval. Could you please tell us, in your opinion, why does Washington now want to remove these formulations? How important are they? And what are the risks of weakening these formulations at this time?
Actually, unfortunately, it's not just happening today. Something similar happened back in February, essentially during the first week of Trump's second presidency. At that time, right around the 3rd anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a draft resolution was being considered at the UN, which was submitted by our European partners and Ukraine. And usually, the United States was also one of the co-authors of such a resolution. And at that time, the United States refused to support this resolution and proposed their own, which was completely neutral, containing only a call to end the war and without any condemnation of Russian aggression or Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the problem actually started back then. This was done formally to show that the United States was already acting as a neutral mediator. They want the war to end, but they will not act as Russia's opponent, nor will they take the position of a country condemning Russia. What we're seeing now is a continuation of that very trend. Perhaps after sanctions were imposed on 2 Russian oil companies and Trump began criticizing Russia, it seemed to many that Trump had switched to Ukraine's side. I'm afraid that's not quite the case. He acts in his own interests. Naturally, he wants the war in Ukraine to end. That's his own political interest. But he hasn't taken our side, just as he was never on Russia's side either. He has always been on his own side. But the fact that the US is now abandoning such wording, unfortunately, is a continuation of the very same position that Trump held at the beginning of his second presidency. A strictly neutral position. What's the danger here? The danger is that the refusal to support Ukraine's territorial integrity suggests that the Trump administration could potentially agree to terms for a ceasefire, to terms for ending hostilities that might allow for certain concessions to Russia. That is the main danger. This is something that, of course, is absolutely unacceptable to us. And here, together with our European partners, we must stand firm on principle, despite, let's say, our respect for Trump, the fight for Trump and his position. But there are things on which we will not agree to such concessions. By the way, something similar already happened in April when the US proposed its own version of a peace plan for Ukraine. There was a clause according to which the US de jure recognized the Russian status of Crimea and de facto recognized the other annexed territories. Not legally, but in fact, they were ready to acknowledge this reality. And at that time, Ukraine, of course, also opposed such recognition. They did not demand that we recognize Crimea as Russian. The US understands that we will not agree to that. Nevertheless, they were ready to take such a step. So unfortunately, this risk, this problem still remains relevant, which is why we, along with our European partners and our American friends, need to fight to ensure that the US position here does not change. We need to remind Trump about the Crimea Declaration, about the fact that during his first presidency, he recognized Crimea as part of Ukraine, and we must continue to fight for this issue. But unfortunately, this is an additional factor indicating that risks do exist. The position of the Trump administration, unfortunately, has its weak points, its potential flaws. Therefore, we must continue to fight for our interests in relations with the Trump administration. But alas, such a problem, such a potential risk does exist.
But at the same time, in parallel, they once again let supposedly the former exiled head of the foreign ministry, Lavrov, who once again declares the same things. Yes, all this denazification and so on and so forth, and the achievement of all the objectives of the special military operation. Are these responses even being heard in the United States or not? But Putin, once again, in simple, everyday terms, Trump is again offering Putin the same perks he offered in the spring. Putin showed stubbornness, refused to agree to them, wanted even more from Trump, and this started to annoy Trump. Again, a rollback, yes, and once again, the same position from the Russian Federation. Am I understanding this correctly or not? So this is just running in circles, isn't it?
Yes, it really is running in an endless circle. In fact, this particular appearance by Lavrov, his recent interview, where on the one hand, there's a clear and explicit call.
A willingness to negotiate.
Exactly right. A willingness to meet with Marco Rubio, with the US Secretary of State. That the meeting fell through, and now Lavrov is suggesting, well, let's meet. But at the same time, the traditional demands for denazification and demilitarization remain. On the one hand, this is a reminder from Lavrov, this is probably the main point, the main meaning of the interview, a reminder that Lavrov is still in place. Lavrov remains the foreign minister of Russia, despite all the rumors about his disgrace, about him being removed. Yet he continues to act in his traditional role. And this is the role of the tough negotiator, who insists on all of Russia's demands, on all of Russia's hardline conditions. Let me remind you that one of the elements of Russia's negotiation tactics with the US is the use of two negotiation tracks and two negotiation strategies. One negotiation track is represented by Kirill Dmitriev, a sort of conditional Trumpist within the Kremlin camp. This is an attempt to reach an understanding with Trump, to agree with the US that the US and Russia should become friends again, become allies, and start full-fledged economic cooperation. And Kirill Dmitriev here plays the role of the constructive negotiator through the mediation of the American special envoy. A person who is supposed to secure this agreement. Lavrov, on the other hand, demonstrates the traditional Russian line. This is a new incarnation, a reincarnation of Andrei Gromyko, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, who was called Mr. No in the West. Lavrov, by the way, is a student of Gromyko. And now he is playing the same role as his former patron. He also presents himself as a tough negotiator, responding with a firm refusal to the Americans' demands. And this tactic of combining constructive and tough approaches was used by Putin situationally from time to time. In principle, it worked quite well for a long time. But then there was a breakdown. This breakdown happened at the end of October, when the Americans, primarily Trump himself, really showed toughness. It was no longer enough for them just to have good conversations with Putin, at least for Trump himself. Yes, apparently Trump enjoyed talking with Putin, listening to his compliments, but Trump wants the war in Ukraine to end. Just talking is not enough for him. And that's why the Americans set a tough condition. Either you negotiate with us about the ceasefire, or there will be no negotiations at all. And as a result, the negotiations did not take place. And this tough approach failed. And judging by various leaks and reports, including those that have been appearing on Russian Telegram channels and similar sources, it seems that indeed Lavrov was the one who was blamed for this particular breakdown. And now Lavrov, pardon the slang, but I think that's pretty much how they talk in the Kremlin, has to fix his own mess, meaning he is now responsible for cleaning up the situation that he himself created.
Vladimir Vyacheslavovich, excuse me for interrupting you. Don't you think this was all staged, just a show for the poor? You know, something put together very quickly and crudely. Look, here's what I see in this supposed disgrace with Lavrov. Lavrov was tasked with disrupting the meeting in Budapest. That's why he was rude to Rubio. Then, by the way, the leak came from the Russian press. If I remember correctly, Kommersant newspaper was the first to report on it, about what kind of disgrace it was and how feathers were flying everywhere at the meeting in the Kremlin. But the main thing was achieved, the meeting didn't take place. Now he continues, then for external audiences, they supposedly removed him from Security Council meetings and so on, creating the appearance that he was out of favor. Then he reappears, but time is passing, and now he's once again proposing to continue the dialogue, stalling for time, but he's no longer talking about Budapest. Budapest is just, now he's proposing a meeting with Rubio instead. It seems to me that it's all logical. This is just a basic, crude stalling tactic and a rude attitude toward both Trump and the United States in general, and toward all these peace initiatives.
I think the situation is actually a bit more complicated, more ambiguous. Lavrov is acting just as he always does, in his usual style. Yes, right now he needs to officially send the signal that they are ready for negotiations, but only on Russian terms. So what is happening with the negotiation process right now? Well, this whole story began at the end of October when the Americans refused to negotiate in Budapest. At that time, it was the Russian side that was more interested in the negotiations at the Budapest summit. The Americans made it clear that they were not interested. They decided to take a pause. But now the situation has changed. Now it very much looks like the Russian side is betting on military action, on strengthening its negotiating position through military means. They are trying to throw all possible resources, all available forces at Pokrovsk, trying to take Pokrovsk, and this is supposed to become their trump card in the negotiations. As long as the issue of Pokrovsk remains unresolved, and potentially they might still try to push further, although right now they lack the strength for an offensive both here and there, so they have taken a pause. And the fact that Lavrov is speaking from such a position of force aligns with Putin's strategy. Putin wants negotiations with Trump. He doesn't want to give up on them, but he's trying to respond to Trump in a Trump-like manner. He wants to show Trump that the Kremlin has trump cards, military trump cards, that Russia continues its offensive. They are trying to achieve at least a small, even if purely symbolic, military revenge. That's the meaning behind using Lavrov in this way. Lavrov acts quite naturally in this regard. I think he actually represents the position that objectively exists in the Kremlin. He's not just playing a role, he acts as a kind of party of war, a kind of party of tough relations with the United States. This is the very style of foreign policy that the Soviet Union used, as I already mentioned, under Gromyko. A tactic of tough confrontation with the United States. For these people, and it's not just Lavrov, but also Patrushev, the Russian military leadership, the FSB officers, the United States is historically an adversary. There are people like Kirill Dmitriev and some others in Putin's inner circle who want to end this war, who want to restore relations with the US. For them, business is more important, as is returning to their old way of life where they could freely travel to the West. And for them, the war is still a risk, an additional risk and a problem. They want to get out of the state of war. But another part of the Kremlin's inner circle, on the contrary, wants to continue this war. So this whole story is more about the internal struggle within the Kremlin, the struggle over the issue of war or ending it. But in any case, Putin wants to end the war on Russia's terms. And once again, he is trying to impose this position on Trump, based on Trump's way of thinking, his approach to negotiations, the topic of bargaining at the talks, and so on. So it's not that this is about to happen to us. It is already happening. I call this negotiation arm wrestling, a kind of struggle both at
Friends, this is just how life is in Ukraine right now. We are in a state of war, and apparently Vladimir Vyacheslavovich, there is a scheduled or emergency power outage. But still, we managed to get answers to many interesting, important, and relevant questions. Let me remind you that this was a conversation with the well-known Ukrainian political analyst Volodymyr Fesenko. That brings our episode today to an end. Thank you all for your attention. By the way, don't forget to like this episode. The discussions and the story are truly very interesting. They deserve to be seen by as many of our viewers as possible. See you next time.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.